So I'm Alice Bonasio and I am Editor-in-Chief of Tech Trends. Well, it was part of the Demystifying Media series, and it was business journalism in a digital age, which is, of course, a very broad subject. But the way that I approached it was through the lens of my own career and how I arrived at the stage where I am today, and then what inspired me to actually start the Tech Trends platform. So I tried to extract some learnings from my own personal experience and the experience of setting up and growing Tech Trends in transferable examples that perhaps the students could leverage in their own careers. And that's what I'm hoping they took away from that. And then towards the end, we also talked about technology and how disruption is actually an opportunity, especially for the new generation of communicators. Well, I think that the key to that is really absorbing a lot of what's around. I think that that a good journalist is always curious, and I know that it can be overwhelming to look at all the content out there. There's definitely more than any one person can ever get through, and I'm constantly finding or being told about new things, and that's okay. But I do think that the more you read of what's out there and immerse yourself in that, then the better idea of what you want to do you also have. So especially, so for example, getting around with Twitter, then find some people that you enjoy following and you can retweet their stuff and see how they do things, and kind of get a feel for what your personality and your footprint should look like from that. So for journalists especially, that there's a lot of good examples out there, because Twitter is actually a very well used tool for journalists to communicate. I have a lot of colleagues that won't answer an email to save their lives, but they'll get back to me on Twitter straight away. So so there is actually a good journalistic community on Twitter that so it's good for sharing your content, it's good for contacting people, sometimes it's good for even getting a scoop. So use it judiciously, but do use social media not only as a microphone or amplification, but also see what possibilities there are for story gathering and for communications around it. Well, again, it's not about obsessing about knowing every detail of everything, especially where it comes to the latest hardware or whatever. Then that's not really my focus. We do more of a technical and product reviews side of the site, but that is something that my deputy Tom Atkinson does mostly. And for me, what I tend to almost look at it with sort of a softer gaze. So I look at a lot of things and perhaps don't go as deeply into some of them. And then if you start seeing a pattern, then you investigate further. But getting too hung up about, like, the latest launch or iteration of something, the landscape moves so quickly that it's almost impossible, and then you kind of don't see the forest for the trees, I think. So so for myself, I like to look at how a technology is affecting an entire industry, for example, and if I can see a shift that goes beyond just one gadget, then that to me starts to signal that there might be a story there. So right from the start, like when I started, one of the stories that I mention and I anchor some of my talk around is actually was how the adult industry started using virtual reality. And to me, that was interesting as an industry trend, because I knew that that the adult industry had been pivotal for the consumer adoption of many other technologies in the past. So if you think of VHS or the internet or even mobile, really, that was pivotal. And then to look at whether the same or when the same would happen for immersive technologies and how it was fundamentally different from other medium, that's a lens that you can then extrapolate to other industries, actually. So it's not, this wasn't just about all sex sells, and that's the story there. Actually, very little of the story was actually about that. Was a broader look, and that's a typical example of a story I find appealing. Well, I think that what really helps is the fact that I worked as an insider in the tech industry for a long period of time. So I'm very familiar with the cultural aspects of it, and I know how prevalent and insular that tech culture can be. So I've worked in small startups, medium startups, large corporations, and in various sectors of tech. And I go to technology conferences, I interview a lot of people in that space. So I think I bring that, I understand the enthusiasm. The reason why I got into tech was because I did have that sort of evangelical, let's make the world a better place, to quote my favorite series, Silicon Valley. That is the kind of mindset that you do go into with tech. And there's so much of it still there that is almost blind to its faults because it's a self-feeding kind of machine. And I became very conscious of that when I went into the reporting side. And I think that that I do pick up on the other side of it. And I think I do bring that perspective. I'm still very, very enthusiastic about the power of technology to do good, but it's not something that I trust to happen in its own right and by itself. That's going to take work. And I think that in a way, the industry will appreciate being pushed in that direction and being held to account because they'll make better decisions and better products out of it. One really good example is actually accessibility, and I've seen some really important and worthwhile moves towards making technology more accessible from people like. At the last Microsoft build, that was part of what Satya Nadella really talked about for Microsoft. They want to make their technology accessible for everyone. And so when you design something that is accessible for like disabled people, or that isn't biased towards one gender or whatever, then that actually makes your product so much better for every user out there. So it's a win-win for them to do it. It's not a compromise. And that I think is the positive message. Once, some companies might be forced into doing things differently because they're doing it wrong at the moment. But once they get there, their product will improve and their users will be happier. And so the end result of it is not actually a punishment. It's going to be a good thing, I believe, for the industry. So I'm very conscious about picking up on those stories, and I have developed a very good radar for filtering out the BS out of that as well. Which is, again, watch Silicon Valley, and if you can laugh at Silicon Valley, then you probably got your radar tuned. If you think that's just how it should work, then that might be more of a problem. I think that what you're building as your assets is really your knowledge. So whenever you are investing time to research a story properly, that is usually, for any kind of feature, you're going to likely spend a lot more time than you're getting paid for. if you're doing it properly, because there's just so much to learn. And that's part of what I enjoy about the job. I'm constantly learning so much, but it is an investment. So what do you then do with that investment and time? And that was part of what I was talking about in my discussion yesterday. You just have to think about, does this work serve multiple purposes? So I'm researching a story, but then am I building expertise and a skill set, and also building contacts through this story? And the answer to all of those, if you're doing it right, then should be yes. So when I build these relationships with people, they're not disposable. They're now people that I know. We work together in a straightforward and ethical way, so that they will continue to take my calls in the future. And then if a collaboration opportunity comes up, or if I see the benefit in making a mutual introduction to somebody else down the line, then that person is part of my network. So that's how you build that expertise that would allow you to. Consulting is a very broad umbrella. It's basically a way to leverage your expertise to help people around specific projects. So that's what I mean about having also a modular skill set that you can leverage to do different things, because you have to adapt your skills. You have to decide what contacts are appropriate to bring in at what times. And then you leverage your judgment to make things happen, basically. So if you have a flexible, sort of dynamic entrepreneurial mindset, then that starts to happen naturally. But I would say don't be intimidated by how complex that sounds, because obviously it takes time to get to that. But even as you're starting to research stories, just be meticulous about keeping track of what you're building. So, keep filing your stories, keep in touch with people afterwards. Do use tools like LinkedIn to keep them in your network. And then when you're building future stories, then think, is there a link to something I've done before? And are these starting to cluster? And then those might bring new ideas for new opportunities. So you're constantly thinking laterally as well as, focused on the job at hand. And that's what being an entrepreneur is about. You're never just doing one thing.